So I am here to talk to you guys today about the NFL salary cap. I want to just cite my sources because I've used a little research in this, and article by Donnie Druin from Sports Illustrated, Jason Fitzgerald, and BJ Natarajan, crunching numbers inside the look of the salary cap. Tad Hallisop, Patrick Mahomes' contract, Matt Johnson, and Henry McKenna. So, all righty, let's get going. A little bit about me. My name is Kate. I went to Rice for my undergrad and majored in sport management and film. I got my master's in strategic communication at Texas Christian. And my current job is I'm a software implementation consultant for a software called Anaplan. Basically Excel on steroids. Highly recommend looking into it if you don't know. Favorite sports, basketball, football, and like those Olympic sports, big Olympics person. And then my favorite teams are the Houston Rockets and the Dallas Cowboys because I am from Montana, so I'm a free agent. I can cheer for whoever I want. All right. So just kind of what we're going to cover today. Basically, let's talk about why they have a salary cap in the NFL. A little bit about that history, what the current salary cap is, because it is negotiated through the collective bargaining agreement. I'm going to talk a little bit about Patrick Mahomes' contract because I think that that's probably one that's relevant. And then also the impact of COVID on kind of what we're looking at kind of moving forward. So I'm mainly going to focus on the salary cap, less on the player contracts. Just kind of keep that in mind because there's a lot of loopholes and things along those lines that I don't have any knowledge of yet, keyword yet, but maybe in the future. So, all right. So this is a quote that I got that kind of explains the whole solution that was trying to be accomplished through the salary cap. So when the whole system started, it was mainly CFOs handling a cap or the GM. A lot of teams began to realize that if they didn't have a person in-house that could give his time or her time to learn the cap and how it works, then they'd have to go out and hire somebody. So if it wasn't managed right, you could also get into trouble immediately. So if you think about a sports team, it mainly runs like a small business. So rather than thinking of them as a team with lots of different employees and revenues and expenses, their P&L still has to balance and everything along those lines. And sometimes the salaries of their players became kind of one of those opportunities. So the idea of a salary cap took the players from being employees and put them more into assets, something that they could trade, something that they could see like kind of a like how that players maybe loses value over time, everything along those lines. So they really took some of those financial aspects of different other asset management and applied it to sports and athletes. So here's a little bit of a history of the salary cap. So in 1989, Plan B was what the teams mainly followed. What that did is it allowed them the ability to keep 37 players whose contracts were expiring and really have first dibs on them. They didn't really have the opportunity once their contract was up to go and try and like go into the free market of any sort. And so in 1992, 9 players sued the NFL, and the courts came back and said, yes, this is illegal what you guys are doing. As a result, because 1,000 players had actually been impacted by this policy, they actually owed $200 million in damages. So it was something that was pretty significant that the league was doing to the players. And so in 1993, they negotiated their first salary cap. It was done through the collective bargaining agreements, and they started out predominantly doing about 2-year contracts. In 2002, they tried to do a 4-year contract, and then in 2006, it was supposed to be a 6-year contract, but then in 2010, the players said, no, we don't like this contract because there was significant revenue changes and they weren't getting a piece of it. So in 2011, they negotiated a 10-year contract. What's interesting about the 2011 contract is it actually changed the strategy away from being a cap and putting it more into a situation where it's based off of cash expenditures. So this is where people who had a finance background really started getting an advantage because they were starting to understand how to like kind of manipulate the system and not necessarily see players or see the salary cap as a hard cap, and see it more as something that they can manipulate through bonuses and different kinds of situations along those lines. Overall, the goal is to avoid a cap hell, is what they kind of say, because it is something that like basically has compound results. So when you think about it, it's something where it might look straightforward up front, but at the end of the day, there are so many different expenses that are carried over time, that if you are relying on the revenue to be continuing to like kind of keep growing at the same rate, there are situations where certain coaches can get into like hot water. Around 2011, it was when people started really thinking about these specialized positions, because I think there are certain teams that have the coach and the general manager being the same person, and that has had some pretty bad effects, because you'll trade away an asset for something that's bad because you're looking for a quick short-term win rather than thinking about the long-term strategy. And that's more what these other individuals were able to do. So around that time, you started seeing different careers come out in sports, like the vice president of football administration. You started seeing people who were assistant general managers, just trying to really focus on this one aspect, because there are so many loopholes and there are so many different ways of manipulating it, that someone needs to do the research for the teams to be able to operate best. So I am going to kind of go through the current basic calculation. So this is on our left side, we actually see the current year's base salary cap, and it's 198,200,000, and that's the number that's actually given to every team right up front. And that's the annual unadjusted salary cap. And I'm going to kind of go into how that's calculated. Then I'm going to go into kind of some of the team specific annual adjustments, and then talk a little bit about cap carryover, because the annual salary cap is not so static. It's something that's super dynamic, and it changes year over year. And so I want to kind of go into a little bit of those details. All right, so first things up, we're going to talk about that number that we just talked, that number I just showed. So that 198,200,000. That is actually made up of a lot of different equations. It's not just a number that's created. It's something that is calculated through league specific revenue, and mainly media contracts. So league media, that is more what you see when it comes to like CBS. That's what you see with NBC. That's what you see with all those different kinds of television broadcast networks that are signing those big contracts for long periods of time to be able to have those exclusivity rights to being able to broadcast certain teams. Because that isn't an NFL owned broadcasting service, the players actually have the advantage. They make 55% of the revenue, where the league makes 45% of the revenue. So those owners get that other piece of the pie, basically. The NFL Ventures postseason revenue is actually the opposite. So that's something that, because it's NFL branded, it's stuff like the Red Zone channel and different kinds of streaming services and the NFL network in general. That is something where actually the players get 45% of the pie and 55% goes to the owners. And then the local revenues is kind of where you get those arguments where it comes to like which areas of the country have the most local support. So you think about how like the Lakers or something along those lines, or in this case, like the Cowboys, they have a very strong local presence. And so they have really strong contracts with their like radio broadcasting system. But that's still something that actually gets shared as a league as a whole. So rather than thinking about that as something where the team itself gets that revenue, it's actually something where the team shares that revenue. And that ultimately kind of gets that point where it's just like, why do I have to share with Jacksonville, like, or Dallas, you know, that kind of like kind of arguments and things along those lines. So that one is split 40% to the players and 60% to the league, because the players are a little bit less involved in those negotiations. But that ultimately just creates a general calculation of total revenue. And so that general calculation of total revenue takes us more into this whole idea of what are the ceilings and floors that are applied in the collective bargaining agreement, and kind of what should be at least given in certain situations. So the minimum amount is actually 47% of that calculated revenue, where the maximum amount actually has changed. They made that a little bit more dynamic. And they did it in 4-year increments as part of the 2011 collective bargaining agreement. So started out at 48%, but it went to 48.5% in the last couple of years. And what that means is that if the revenue for some reason explodes, the players can't get more than 48.5%. So it automatically rounds that down rather than seeing it as like an advantage. And so a lot of that extra revenue actually ends up going more towards the league as a whole, even though it is still just a percentage, because the players could have technically made more money in the long run. So that just sets up basically the what's considered that total revenue. That just sets up a number that then they're marching towards. And then what they have is other kinds of like giving back to the community, right? That's where you're going to see the joint venture contributions credit, because that's like the medical research. That is like the community service operations, things like that. They don't want that to just be something that the league offers, but they also want the players to be a part of that as well, because it is something that like usually they're contributing back as well. And so that's subtracted out because that is something that is kind of more of an expense for them. And the remaining amount of that is what is then divided up evenly among the teams, as well as the projected player benefits. So the projected player benefits are even stuff as like simple as like rookie orientation. And it's stuff like, let me think here, you got like preseason sales of tickets. Like these are actually things that are considered player benefits, also like healthcare and things along those lines. But because it's divided evenly between the number of teams, this is also part of why the idea of expanding the NFL is often kind of looked into as like, oh no, because then we have to share this number with more teams. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you open a new team in a new city, that they're going to generate enough revenue to make it worth it for the other teams. And so that's part of why the total unadjusted salary cap, which you get to in that first part up there, is so important. Is that that's kind of what teams are marching towards every single day, every single year. And they are very reliant on this expected and projected revenue that's coming down the line, because that's basically what allows them the ability to kind of make gutsy decisions when it comes to the players that they decide to draft. So when you see the annual unadjusted salary cap, so that number 198,200,000, that's just one piece, but it has a lot of things that go into it. And that's where when the collective bargaining agreement, which is going to be up next year, probably gets negotiated, you'll kind of better understand what the changes are that the players are fighting for versus what the league is trying to request and things along those lines. All right, I'm going to go into now like basically the team specific annual adjustments. So the team specific annual adjustments are kind of straightforward what they sound like. What happens is that this is usually something that is done in a negative sense. So it's something where in 2010, when they didn't have any salary cap at all, the Cowboys gave Miles Austin a huge contract, and they really didn't have the money to give him that contract. But since there was technically no salary cap, they did so anyways. Once the salary cap went into effect in 2011, though, they were no longer operating under the rules of what was agreed upon between those two different contracts. And so as a result, they actually had to pay a penalty. Apparently something was going on with the NFC East because the Redskins, I mean, Washington's football team now, they had a similar situation where they were adding certain clauses into contracts that never existed in any context. And so both teams ended up actually having to pay back the league certain benefits that were like basically that they maintained from those decisions. And so those are considered like negative team adjustments. It can also include stuff where you have certain players that have earned bonuses, but it happened like in odd periods of time. And so that can actually be something that the league still provides as part of the team's adjustments, because it should have been paid out in the previous year, but it didn't get paid out. So that ultimately gives you that revenue and adjustments. And then finally, you have the cap carryover. So this was actually the like real significant change that happened in 2011, because this is what allowed teams kind of the ability to, if you think about it, like think about like credit card, right? So you have a certain amount that you can spend, but you eventually have to pay it all off and things along those lines. This allowed them the ability to like really give their credit score really high. And then they end up just basically blowing it all on certain players and things along those lines. So rather than having that cap be something that players expected, this was something where teams were able to kind of negotiate and say, hey, we don't we aren't going to pay you as much because we want to be able to build the team moving forward. And so you saw kind of those team friendly contracts that would start coming down the line, because that was really where the players would end up having certain advantages where that was more where they had kind of taken a sacrifice in the idea that the team itself would be benefit in the long run. So Avi, I've seen you ask a couple of questions in here, so I'm going to stop here and kind of answer those. It looks like one of them is, what's the difference between this and the luxury tax? So this is different because this is actually something where this money is actually given to the team. The team itself has the ability to spend this money. It's not something that's a penalty at all. It's actually given to them as part of that revenue. Where the luxury tax is more something where teams are possibly getting, and I might be wrong on this honestly, because I didn't do too much research in the comparison, but my understanding is luxury tax has more of a negative implication, where cap carryover is something where it's like, basically this was money that you've saved and now you can spend it in any way you want. It was basically something that teams loved because they were able to still be within that salary cap, but it made it less hard. It was more softer because yes, that was our number that we are trying to march towards, but at the end of the day, like, I saved money, so I'm going to go and buy Tom Brady because I had the money left over. And that's what allows a kind of more of a competitive advantage for certain teams who are trying to build in the long run. As kind of I wrote down here is like, in football, you can take it with you. So if you don't spend the money, you can bring it with you the next year. All right, next one we got here is, so basically let's talk about kind of that team spending. So in 2011, like I said, there were two specified timeframes of when these players were expected for the teams to actually spend that money. So with that, basically between 2011 and 2015, as well as 2016, sorry, 2013 and 2016, they had to spend up to 89% of that salary. So even though technically this carryover happened, there were actually certain expectations that were set for them to not necessarily just hold on to that money, because it is still like, quote unquote, like free money of sorts that the league is providing to the teams, because it's not necessarily revenue that they generated, it's revenue that the league generated. And so there were two windows in 2017, and then it'll happen again in 2021, where they have to basically reallocate those funds out to everybody if you haven't spent it. So if we think about back on that first slide where I showed you basically like the Browns have a huge amount of cap space available, technically if they don't spend that this year, they're going to have to give that out back to their players in the certain proportions, because it can't be something that the team ends up just getting as money. It's something where that's still expected. And the league is also held responsible for similar expenses. So if the team reaches their thresholds, then any kinds of saved money by the league has to then be also reallocated out to the players. So there's no real penalty for not spending it throughout those 4-year increments, but at the end, it's kind of, it comes back. However, because players know that there are certain requirements of the teams that they have to spend certain amounts, that's where you'll see the player holdouts, because that's basically where they're making it an executive decision at that point to be like, yo, this is my money, I've earned it, I get hit every day, that kind of stuff. And if they're really good players, they know that the team has the money, because it's all online. Like, you can find a lot of these different things in certain websites where they're tracking down to the dollar how much money each team has. So someone like Ezekiel Elliott asking for his contract to be renewed earlier than other years is because he knew that there was less competitive advantage in that year versus the year when he was supposed to be going up. And so he could set the standard, because that was 3 years before the salary cap was supposed to increase. So he wanted to get as much as he could up front. So those are kind of what you'll see as a result of this being really open to the public. So however you guys kind of think keep it simple. There are still priority personnel that needs to be done, right? So certain teams you have to have a certain number of players. These are just kind of that priority stuff, priority positions that you're expecting. But at the end of the day, they do have to narrow down, but they also have to be able to plan ahead. So this is where, once again, you might have a coach who wants to win now because his job's on the line, but if he trades away something that could be a potential asset in the future, that could actually end up hurting them more in the long run. And that's why they separated the coach from kind of the general manager or the finance side of things, to keep it where you have somebody that's kind of an unbiased person. All right, so I'm going to kind of talk about a few salary cap strategies now. So these are just a few that were in that book, Crunching Numbers, that I just wanted to highlight because they seem to be predominantly the most used. The traditional strategy is what you'll hear most of the time, and this is kind of what has been happening since the beginning. There are the 3-year contracts, and basically how they get away with this is they have a large signing bonus up front. So the players actually end up taking more of a minimum as a annual salary, because a bonus, when they decide to get a bonus, like if I get a $10 million bonus, it is actually going to be where the $10 million hit the salary cap in increments over the course of like 3 or 4 years, where the salary itself is a smaller amount. The player still gets paid that signing bonus up front, but the team itself doesn't accrues the cost of that over time. So it's something where teams have seen this as an advantage, because rather than seeing their number be rather than see that $10 million in that first year, they see $1.2 million in the first year, $3 million, and then $4 million, etc., over the 4 years as the signing bonus, because bonuses can be spread, where the salaries themselves get to be a fixed rate of what they kind of expect that growth to be. And I'll explain this a little bit more when I go to the Patrick Mahomes example. But the whole idea of this is very popular because it allows the teams to really have more of a timeline that they can control, because there isn't as much guaranteed money after the fact, and they can kind of have a good understanding of how long they're going to give people windows of opportunity. Most teams end up using this kind of strategy, or at least they did in 2016. And so it's very popular, and you can kind of see it when you look at kind of the industry trends. The next one is the all cash philosophy. So this is actually something that is more recently used, because this is where, when it became cash versus cap, these were the people who really wanted everything just to be easy math, right? Because the whole idea is that most of the guarantee is actually in the salaries. And that is where literally the salary cap is the cash that they spend every year. So it's the opposite in a way of that traditional strategy, where the salaries actually are where they see the amounts. And then that really leads them into more of a pay-as-you-go kind of model, because they can keep on extending those. But at the same time, most people are happy within those first 2 years, and then they kind of get into the renegotiations. The next one is going to be the multiple year proration avoidable contracts. So what that means is these are like those superstar contracts that you'll see, like the Cowboys. They're a really good example of this. This is what they do. They give you long contracts that are supposed to help keep the superstars, and it's really nearly impossible to release. So this is the whole situation that they got into with Tony Romo. Tony Romo had just signed a new contract right when Dak had taken over for him, because he had gotten injured again. And as a result, they kept on having that dead cap space. And that's basically just money that they have to pay players that are just part of their contract, even if they aren't even on the team anymore. And so that is sometimes just a cost that they have to keep on accruing. And it's really bad, just because it's really, really hard to get out of these contracts. The whole idea is you're banking on these contracts being something where that player keeps on performing at that superstar level. But at the end of the day, it's like it's really hard to make those predictions at all, because that's not something that you can really track to or plan for. And then the last one is more this early extension and incentives. So this is something where the teams have actually focused more on those drafted players. So what that means is that if you get a player that's in the draft, right, they have a certain minimum, and that's why that rookie minimum is so important. If you can get them to sign a contract before they kind of meet their full value, then you can get them into a lower contract than if they were to sign a contract year 3 or year 4 of their rookie deal, because that's where they've already shown their value as they go. And that's kind of where it it hurts. It can hurt the team longer to wait at certain times if that player performs really well. It does add a little bit of protection for injury and holdouts because the players haven't really gotten into that whole different process. And this just makes them more incentive driven just because all the bonuses are associated more with performance. So next thing I want to do is I kind of want to use Patrick Mahomes as kind of the example of how you can interpret how contracts are written and how this can be actually something that benefits the team rather than necessarily being something where it sounds like a media kind of claim. So I put him as a $500 million man. And the reason is that he has the potential within this contract of making $503 million. But in order for him to do that, he has to not only play all 12 years, but he also has to win the MVP every year. And the Chiefs have to win the Super Bowl. So that $25 million between what his actual like contract terms is and what the media buzz was of the $503 million contract is really just where it's like, the Chiefs can risk that, right? Like if you think about it, right? Like $25 million, they definitely make that over the course of 12 years. So that little buffer, if they keep on winning the Super Bowl, they will definitely make up that money and more in that whole time frame. This also is actually a very team-friendly deal because it really is only a 4 or 5 year contract for them to really start making some of these decisions. So what you'll see is basically you've got the base salary. This is kind of that whole example of like, that's not that high of a base salary, but he signed a $10 million signing bonus. So he got that $10 million up front, even though it's technically spread over 5 years, he got that day one. And so he got $10 million, $825,000. So that makes him pretty happy for 5 years. And at the same time, this is going to just keep on going up. His base salary is going to keep on going up. What's even crazier about this for him is as long as he's on the roster here, that's where he's going to really make his money, is like he doesn't have to be playing, but he's on the roster. And so as long as he's active and playing, that's what gives him that money. And then he gets money just for working out. It's a pretty great deal for him. So the cap hit itself is worth it for the team because the team knows the revenue normally just keeps on going up. Now, COVID's kind of thrown things into flux, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, they're really just signing a 5 year contract here. And after 5 years, so around 2024, that's actually when he gets more into a situation where every year he is really signing up for the next year. And so that's something where it can easily be where as long as you don't have that dead cap space over here, you can let a player go after that point. But if he's still performing, like this could easily be less than what the average is for a quarterback at that caliber at that point. So basically they're banking on the idea that even in 2027, so in around 9 years, a quarterback is probably going to be valued more than 49 million a year, which is possible if you really look at the trends that are developing. So the whole idea of this contract is that you have to look at it rather than as the media headline and kind of look at the basics to understand that like teams aren't dumb. They're not going to just give $500 million away to a quarterback without really thinking about the ROI that they're going to have. So the last thing I just want to talk about before I open it up for questions is kind of what this COVID impact is going to be, because I think it's important to really think about this as in our current context, because the salary cap normally was like a well-oiled machine. Like the players knew it was going to keep going up, the league knew it was going to keep going up, but something like COVID where it kicks people out of the stadiums and it makes people not be able to, and the viewership even on TV has gone down, like that's actually a really significant thing for teams. And given that they're going into a CBA discussion year, like this could really hurt both sides, or it could weaken one side in their arguments against the other, right? Like owners have tons of money, they're fine. The players themselves could actually lose some of their advantage in this whole thing. So in July, they actually met and they talked about basically a floor for next year that's different than that minimum that we discussed earlier. The reason being is that there's a good chance that it would trend to the revenue dropping to a point where that minimum amount is pretty significantly minimum because it's just a percentage of that revenue. It's not necessarily a set number. And so they made this agreement that they have agreed to 175 million salary cap floor next year. And they've agreed to basically allow this year to be mainly guaranteed contracts as long as the players end up playing and finishing out the season. So teams could easily have said, no, we're going to cut back on this stuff. But as a result, even of that 175 million at the time that I looked at this, there are still quite a few teams that don't even have 175 million dollars in their based off their current active contracts. So I won't be surprised if next year we start seeing some reduced contracts where people are taking pay cuts. And I won't be surprised if they also cut certain players that are more that high level, as long as they don't have that dead cap value, for cheaper alternatives. Like I think a running back is a pretty good example of that, that being something that's more disposable, that's been proven by the New England Patriots for years. So the other kind of caveat to this whole thing is, since they know that this year they're going to be losing revenue, they are actually spreading out that cost associated with it in 2024. So they think by that time they should be getting back onto a good track, and that should allow them the ability to recover. But I think that this is a really interesting year for us to kind of research, just because we know for a fact that, I mean, the Philadelphia Eagles are almost $100 million over this new salary cap minimum. And if the revenue isn't projected to be that high next year, there could be some really serious consequences for certain teams. So, all right, that is it. Do we have any questions?
I have a dumb one. So I guess what you're saying, this was great, Kate. This was very eye-opening as well. Especially, I love the Patrick Mahomes example, because you see the headlines of the $500 million, but you don't realize what exactly all the caveats are for him to get the $500 million. My question is, so I buy a ticket for the Texans for $100. So what you're saying is that money does not go to the Texans. That money goes to the NFL, and collectively all these fans are paying the NFL, and like a dad, they're just kind of giving an allowance to all of these teams every year to be able to pay their players then.
Kind of, yes, because it's more where the NFL is in cahoots with the owners. So the NFL and the owners get money basically, where they're both going to get they're going to get 55% of that revenue. It's the players being kind of the assets that the teams have to automatically play in order to have the product, that is where the players get that money. The teams still are going to get money from that purchase. They always see the money from that purchase, but the players get a percentage of it, part of this.
I guess the reason I'm asking that is because I always am curious about small market teams, right? Like even in basketball, other sports as well, right? And I think that is the big X factor. Like I was thinking about Jacksonville, and I'm like, how many people, I guess they have a lot of people that watch football, but I don't know, like a lot of the other smaller market, I can't think of one off the top of my head.
No, Jacksonville's a really good example. That's why they're thinking about moving to London, like because they actually don't have the same amount of revenue that's generated compared to like even other Florida counterparts and different things.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I couldn't see them bringing in as much money as like back in the day, or the Chiefs, or like any big market team that's out there, right? So I don't know. I'm curious if I don't think other sports work that way with. So can you speak a little bit about, do you know anything about other salary caps and stuff?
I was going to do some comparative analysis of the two, but this got to so much more math than I thought it was going to. And so I had to figure out those, but I can definitely kind of follow back up with that and have a update. Because I definitely want to look into like also the other sports, because that whole idea of a soft versus hard cap has always been kind of misunderstood, as well as like the MLB not even having a cap.
Right.
There are some differences that are really important.
Cool.
I think we have less than a minute, so sorry everybody else if you wanted to ask a question, but we'll talk to you guys later.
And thanks, Michelle, for joining us today. I hope you liked it. Hope you can do a presentation for us someday. So thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, appreciate it, Kate.
Bye.
Tough.